May 27, 1940, 4:47 a.m. Ramsgate Harbor, Kent. Charles Lightoller stood on the deck of a 60-foot motor yacht, watching as a Royal Navy officer chalked numbers on the boats tied alongside the pier. 58 feet, 42 feet, 35 feet. When the officer reached Lightoller's yacht, he paused, examined the vessel's lines, and wrote "Sundowner" 60 feet on his clipboard. The officer moved to the next boat without explanation. Lightoller, 76 years old, his face weathered by 5 decades at sea, knew exactly what was happening. The Admiralty was requisitioning civilian vessels. France was collapsing. The British Expeditionary Force was trapped on the beaches at Dunkirk. The Royal Navy needed every boat that could float. What the officer didn't know, what nobody standing on that pier could have imagined, was that the old man in the worn peacoat had already survived one of history's greatest maritime disasters. Lightoller had been second officer aboard the Titanic, the most senior officer to survive when the ship sank in 1912. He had spent 2 hours in the North Atlantic clinging to an overturned lifeboat, watching 1,500 people die. Now, 28 years later, he was about to sail into another catastrophe. But this time, he wasn't planning to survive. He was planning to save as many lives as possible before physics or the Luftwaffe stopped him. The story of Dunkirk has been told countless times. 338,000 men evacuated in 9 days. Churchill's miracle of deliverance. The little ships that crossed the channel. But the story rarely explains how close the entire operation came to complete failure, or why civilian vessels succeeded where the Royal Navy initially couldn't, or what specifically made Operation Dynamo work when every calculation suggested it would end in slaughter. The answer lies not in one crazy boat, but in 845 of them, and in the bureaucratic desperation that led the Admiralty to abandon conventional naval doctrine and trust weekend sailors to execute the largest evacuation in military history. The crisis began on May 10, 1940, when Germany invaded France and the Low Countries. The Wehrmacht's armored spearheads punched through the Ardennes forest, bypassing the Maginot Line entirely, achieving in 3 days what German armies had failed to accomplish in 4 years during World War I. By May 20, German tanks had reached the English Channel at Abbeville, cutting the British Expeditionary Force and French First Army off from the rest of France. 350,000 Allied troops were trapped in a pocket 60 miles wide and 40 miles deep, with their backs to the sea. Lord Gort, commanding the BEF, recognized immediately that retreat was the only option. But retreat to where? The Channel ports, Calais, Boulogne, Dunkirk, were under attack. German bombers controlled the skies. U-boats prowled offshore. The Royal Navy had destroyers, but not enough transport capacity. Even if ships could reach the beaches, how would soldiers board them? The beaches at Dunkirk shelved gradually, meaning large vessels couldn't approach the shore. Troops would have to wade hundreds of yards through chest-deep water. In calm conditions, that might work, but under air attack, with exhausted soldiers carrying weapons and equipment, the mathematics were grim. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, Flag Officer Dover, received orders on May 20 to begin planning an evacuation. Ramsay, 57 years old, had retired from active service in 1938 after disagreements with superiors, only to be recalled when war began. He operated from tunnels beneath Dover Castle, a maze of damp corridors and inadequate lighting that had been excavated during the Napoleonic Wars. The facilities were primitive, the communications equipment outdated, and the staff overworked. From these tunnels, Ramsay was expected to coordinate the largest military evacuation in history. His initial estimates were catastrophic. The Royal Navy had 41 destroyers available. Each destroyer could carry approximately 700 troops per crossing. The distance from Dover to Dunkirk was 39 nautical miles, meaning a round trip of at least 6 hours, longer if German artillery or air attacks forced evasive maneuvering. Assuming continuous operations, the destroyers might evacuate 45,000 men before German forces overran the perimeter. That meant 300,000 soldiers would be captured or killed. Churchill's War Cabinet discussed the numbers on May 26. The Prime Minister told them to expect losses of 50,000 at minimum. The Admiralty projected that 30,000 might be saved if conditions remained favorable. Nobody believed conditions would remain favorable. German air superiority was absolute. Luftwaffe bomber formations operated without significant opposition. The few RAF fighter squadrons based in southeast England were outnumbered and operating at maximum range. The evacuation would happen under continuous air attack, in daylight, with minimal fighter cover. It would be a massacre. Then, someone at the Admiralty remembered the Thames barges. The River Thames had always been a working waterway, crowded with cargo vessels, fishing boats, barges, tugs, and ferries. These vessels were shallow draft, meaning they could approach beaches where destroyers couldn't. They were also numerous. The Port of London alone had hundreds of suitable craft. If the Navy could requisition them, crew them, and get them to Dunkirk, they might significantly increase evacuation capacity. On May 14th, 6 days before the evacuation order, the Admiralty had issued a secret directive to regional small vessels pool officers. Compile lists of all privately owned motor vessels between 30 and 100 feet in length. Owners were to report their boat's specifications, speed, and seaworthiness. The directive didn't explain why. Most boat owners assumed it was for coastal patrol or minesweeping. By May 27th, when Operation Dynamo officially began, the Admiralty had identified over 2,000 potential vessels. But identification was different from availability. Most boats were civilian-owned, moored in private harbors, with civilian crews who had no obligation to participate in military operations. The Admiralty could requisition the boats, but not the crews, and sending naval personnel to crew 845 civilian vessels would require thousands of trained sailors who were desperately needed elsewhere. The solution emerged through necessity rather than planning. The Admiralty would requisition the boats, provide minimal instructions, and trust civilian volunteers to sail them across the channel. It was unprecedented. Naval regulations explicitly prohibited civilian vessels from operating in combat zones, but regulations written during peacetime seemed irrelevant when 300,000 men were about to be captured. The call went out on the evening of May 26th. The BBC broadcast a cryptic message. Boat owners with vessels capable of channel crossings should contact their nearest naval station immediately. No explanation was provided. The message repeated every hour. Within 12 hours, over 400 boat owners had volunteered. They arrived at Ramsgate, Sheerness, and Dover with questions the Navy couldn't answer. How many troops should they carry? What route should they follow? What should they do if attacked? The officers organizing the evacuation didn't know. Nobody had ever attempted anything like this. Charles Lightoller heard the broadcast while having dinner. He owned Sundowner, a motor yacht built in 1912, the same year Titanic sank. The boat was 60 feet long, powered by twin engines, and designed for coastal cruising, not channel crossings under combat conditions. Lightoller had no obligation to volunteer. At 76, he was decades past military age. His seafaring days were supposedly over, but when his son Roger suggested they take Sundowner to Dunkirk, Lightoller agreed immediately. They departed Ramsgate on May 31st, joining a flotilla of small boats heading toward France. The Admiralty had provided charts and coordinates, but little else. The boats navigated independently, following destroyers and larger vessels across the channel. German E-boats, fast attack craft armed with torpedoes, operated along the route, sinking several small vessels during the night. Luftwaffe bombers attacked anything moving. The RAF provided fighter cover, but outnumbered Spitfires and Hurricanes couldn't be everywhere simultaneously. Sundowner reached Dunkirk at dawn on June 1st. The scene was apocalyptic. The harbor was blocked by wrecked ships. Oil fires burned along the waterfront, producing black smoke that rose thousands of feet. German artillery shelled the beaches systematically. Stuka dive bombers screamed down every few minutes, their sirens audible over the explosions. And everywhere, stretching for miles along the sand, were soldiers, thousands of them, standing in organized lines reaching into the surf, waiting with a patience that seemed impossible given the circumstances. The evacuation had been underway for 5 days. Over 200,000 men had already been taken off, far exceeding initial estimates. But the pace was slowing. German forces were tightening the perimeter. The beaches were under constant bombardment. Larger ships had withdrawn after suffering heavy losses. The remaining soldiers, mostly French and British rearguard units, were trapped in a shrinking pocket barely 3 miles wide. Lighthauler maneuvered Sundowner as close to the beach as possible, grounding the yacht in shallow water. Soldiers waded out, climbed aboard, and packed themselves wherever space existed. The boat's rated capacity was 21 passengers. Lighthauler loaded 130. They filled the deck, the cabin, the engine room access, every available surface. The yacht sat so low in the water that waves broke over the gunwales. Basic physics suggested the vessel would sink the moment it moved. Lighthauler engaged the engines and headed back toward England. The return crossing took 4 hours. Sundowner wallowed in the swells, overloaded to the point where steering was barely responsive. German aircraft attacked twice. Messerschmitt fighters strafed the beaches and anything moving offshore. Lighthauler maintained course, unable to take evasive action because any sudden maneuver would capsize the overloaded yacht. The bullets missed, or rather, they hit the water near the boat, close enough that soldiers on deck could see the splashes, but not close enough to cause damage. Luck, not skill, determined survival. Sundowner reached Ramsgate at 2 p.m. Soldiers disembarked, were counted, and were loaded onto trains heading inland. Lighthauler refueled, took on water, and prepared to return to Dunkirk. A naval officer approached and told him the evacuation was ending. The perimeter had collapsed. German forces had entered Dunkirk's outskirts. Return trips were too dangerous. Lighthauler protested, but ultimately complied. Sundowner had completed 1 round trip and evacuated 130 men. 1 boat, 1 crossing, 130 lives saved. Across the channel, hundreds of other boats were performing similar evacuations. The Thames River steamer Crested Eagle burned after a bombing attack, but stayed operational long enough to transfer her troops to another vessel. The Isle of Man ferry Medway Queen made 7 round trips before being sunk by a Stuka. The paddle steamer Medway Queen, equipped with anti-aircraft guns, shot down 3 German aircraft while evacuating 7,000 troops across 7 voyages. The minesweeper HMS Oriole evacuated troops despite having her stern blown off by a mine. The list of vessels damaged, sunk, or pushed beyond their design limits was extensive and growing by the hour. The small boats operated under conditions that should have been impossible. Many had civilian crews with no military training, navigating using maps purchased from chandlers, communicating via commercial radio frequencies, coordinating through ad hoc signals and common sense. They were attacked by aircraft, shelled by coastal artillery, threatened by mines, and operating in seas crowded with hundreds of other vessels following no organized traffic pattern. The fact that more boats didn't collide or sink from confusion was itself remarkable. But the small boats solved a problem the Royal Navy couldn't. Large destroyers, drawing 15 feet or more, had to anchor offshore and wait for soldiers to reach them by wading or by smaller craft ferrying troops from the beaches. The process was slow. Small boats could beach themselves, load directly, and depart within minutes. A destroyer might evacuate 700 men in one trip, taking 6 hours. 20 small boats could evacuate 700 men in multiple trips over the same period, with greater flexibility and less vulnerability to air attack. The Admiralty hadn't planned this. The doctrine emerged organically as boat crews discovered what worked. Larger vessels anchored offshore became loading platforms. Small boats shuttled between beaches and the larger vessels, ferrying soldiers in relays. Destroyers and personnel ships then transported troops back to England in bulk. The system was inefficient by conventional naval standards, with no centralized coordination and constant improvisation, but it worked. The evacuation rate increased from 15,000 per day on May 29 to 68,000 on May 31. The breakthrough came at the East Mole, a thin wooden breakwater extending a mile into the sea. The mole was never designed as a berthing pier. It was a breakwater meant to protect the harbor from storms, constructed from narrow wooden planking barely wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast. But on May 27, a Navy officer realized that destroyers could tie up alongside the mole, allowing soldiers to walk directly aboard instead of wading through the surf. The first destroyer to try was HMS Wolsey, which berthed on May 27 and loaded 950 troops in 47 minutes. Other destroyers followed. The mole became the evacuation's central artery. Ships berthed in sequence, loaded as many troops as physically possible, and departed immediately. The loading rate was staggering. HMS Sabre evacuated 700 troops in 30 minutes. HMS Esk loaded 900 in under an hour. The wooden planking groaned under the weight of thousands of men moving continuously, but it held. German bombers attacked the mole repeatedly. Stukas dove from altitude, releasing bombs that cratered the wooden structure or exploded in the water nearby, sending geysers of spray across the waiting soldiers. Several ships were hit while berthed. HMS Grenade took a direct hit, exploded, and sank tied to the mole, blocking access for hours until tugs could clear the wreck. HMS Wakeful was torpedoed by an E-boat while evacuating troops, sinking in 15 seconds with over 600 casualties. The losses were horrific, but the evacuations continued. For every ship sunk, 2 more took its place. The RAF flew continuous patrols over Dunkirk, engaging German bombers before they could reach the beaches. But RAF fighter squadrons were based in southeast England, meaning patrol time over Dunkirk was measured in minutes before fuel exhaustion forced them to return. The Germans, operating from captured French airfields, had longer loiter times and numerical superiority. British soldiers on the beach, enduring hours of bombardment with minimal fighter cover visible, concluded the RAF had abandoned them. The accusation was unfair. RAF pilots flew multiple sorties per day and suffered heavy losses, but to men on the ground, the sky appeared dominated by Luftwaffe bombers. The weather provided the only consistent protection. On June 1st, heavy clouds and rain grounded the Luftwaffe for most of the day. Evacuation rates soared. 64,000 troops were removed in 24 hours, the highest daily total of the operation. When skies cleared on June 2, German bombers returned, and evacuation rates dropped. The correlation was absolute. Cloud cover meant survival. Clear skies meant casualties. By June 3, the perimeter had shrunk to a narrow strip along Dunkirk's waterfront. German artillery had direct line of sight to the beaches. Shells landed continuously, cratering the sand, sending shrapnel across the waiting formations. Yet the soldiers remained in organized lines, disciplined, waiting their turn to board. The alternative was chaos, and chaos meant fewer men evacuated. British and French officers maintained order at gunpoint if necessary, shooting anyone who attempted to rush the boats out of sequence. The final evacuations occurred on the night of June 3rd to 4th. By dawn on June 4th, the last Allied troops had departed. German forces entered Dunkirk at 8 a.m. to find the town destroyed, the harbor wrecked, and the beaches littered with abandoned equipment, but almost no prisoners. 338,000 men had been evacuated. The operation that was supposed to save 30,000 at best had rescued 11 times that number. Churchill addressed Parliament on June 4th, delivering the speech that contained the famous line, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight in the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." But he also warned, wars are not won by evacuations. Dunkirk was a deliverance, not a victory. Britain had saved its army, but abandoned France. The BEF left behind 2,000 artillery pieces, 60,000 vehicles, 76,000 tons of ammunition, and 400,000 tons of supplies. Re-equipping would take months, training replacements would take longer, and Britain now stood alone against a German war machine that had just conquered Western Europe in 6 weeks. Yet the evacuation success exceeded all projections. The Admiralty's initial estimate of 30,000 evacuated proved catastrophically pessimistic. The final count was over 300,000. How had the prediction been so wrong? The answer lay in factors that planners couldn't have anticipated. Weather that grounded the Luftwaffe during critical periods, German hesitation in pressing the attack, Hitler's order to halt armored units on May 24, and the small boats. The small boats were the variable nobody had calculated correctly. The Admiralty knew civilian vessels existed, but didn't know how many would volunteer, how effectively they could operate, or whether civilian crews could function under combat conditions. The answer to all 3 questions was more than expected. 845 civilian vessels participated in Operation Dynamo. Their combined capacity exceeded the entire Royal Navy destroyer fleet. And crucially, they operated in shallow water where destroyers couldn't, directly on beaches, loading continuously. Charles Lightoller's single trip on Sundowner evacuated 130 men, but Sundowner was just one of 845. The Thames steamer Golden Eagle made 3 round trips and evacuated 580. The hospital carrier St. Andrew evacuated over 800 wounded. The Dutch coaster Hilda evacuated 500 troops despite having no military equipment whatsoever, navigating by dead reckoning and luck. The cumulative effect was decisive. Small boats evacuated approximately 1/3 of all troops rescued during Dynamo. Without them, total evacuations would have been closer to 200,000. That additional 140,000 men represented nearly the entire trained strength of the British Army's infantry and support units. Losing them would have left Britain virtually defenseless against invasion. But the small boats' impact extended beyond raw numbers. They demonstrated something the British public desperately needed to see, that ordinary people could affect the war's outcome. The image of weekend sailors crossing the channel under fire to rescue the army resonated far more powerfully than impersonal accounts of naval operations. The little ships became a symbol of British resilience, a narrative of collective action and mutual sacrifice that transcended military statistics. The narrative was somewhat romanticized. Many small boats were crewed by naval personnel, not civilian volunteers. The most dangerous evacuations from the beaches were conducted by destroyers and military vessels, not yachts. And the evacuation succeeded primarily because the Luftwaffe failed to achieve the level of destruction it was capable of, either through weather interference, RAF resistance, or German tactical errors. But the core truth remained. Civilian boats, volunteering for a mission with no guarantee of success, had helped save the British Army. The cost was significant. 6 destroyers were sunk. 19 personnel ships and transport vessels went down. Over 200 small boats were lost to bombing, artillery, or simple mechanical failure. The total death toll among crews was over 3,500. For every 10 men evacuated, one sailor or boat crew member died getting them home. The mathematics of sacrifice were brutal but necessary. German forces occupied Dunkirk on June 4th and discovered, to their astonishment, that they had captured almost nothing. The beaches were littered with equipment, but prisoners numbered only 40,000, mostly wounded men left behind by field hospitals that couldn't be evacuated. Goering had promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe would prevent any significant evacuation. He had failed. The Wehrmacht had driven the British Army into the sea, but hadn't destroyed it. Hitler's May 24 halt order remained controversial for decades. Why stop the panzers when they were within striking distance of Dunkirk? Historians offered multiple explanations: concern about armored units outrunning their supply lines, fear of tank losses in marshy terrain, deference to Goering's promise that air power could finish the job, or simple miscalculation. Whatever the reason, the halt provided 48 hours for British forces to establish a defensive perimeter that held just long enough for the evacuation to succeed. Had the panzers pressed forward on May 24th, they would have reached Dunkirk's outskirts by May 26th, 2 days before the evacuation peaked. The beaches would have been under direct tank fire. Evacuations from the East Mole would have been impossible. The small boats would have sailed into a killing zone. Total evacuations might have reached 50,000 at most. The British Army would have been destroyed. Operation Sea Lion, the planned German invasion of Britain, might have proceeded in late 1940 with Britain virtually defenseless. But the panzers didn't press forward, and when they resumed the attack on May 26th, the British perimeter held. French forces, particularly the First Army, fought desperately to protect the evacuation, suffering catastrophic losses. Over 35,000 French soldiers defended the perimeter while British forces evacuated, then surrendered when ammunition ran out. Their sacrifice bought the time needed for an additional 100,000 evacuations. The French contribution to Dunkirk's success is often overlooked in British accounts, but without it, the operation would have collapsed. The aftermath reshaped British strategy. Churchill's government recognized that Britain couldn't defeat Germany alone. American intervention was essential, but American public opinion was isolationist. Roosevelt wanted to help, but faced congressional opposition. Dunkirk provided a narrative. Britain had suffered disaster, but survived through courage and determination. The story of the little ships, of civilian boats rescuing the army, resonated with American audiences. It suggested that Britain wouldn't collapse, that continued resistance was possible, that American aid wouldn't be wasted supporting a lost cause. Over the following months, American material support increased. The Lend-Lease Act, signed in March 1941, provided weapons and supplies essential for Britain's survival. The narrative that Britain would fight to the last, exemplified by Dunkirk, helped overcome isolationist resistance. Whether the evacuation's propaganda value exceeded its military significance remains debatable, but both were substantial. The veterans of Dunkirk formed the core of British forces for the remainder of the war. The soldiers evacuated in June 1940 fought in North Africa, Italy, Normandy, and eventually Germany itself. Without Dunkirk, Britain's army in 1944 would have consisted largely of raw recruits with minimal combat experience. The troops who landed at Normandy included thousands who had been pulled off Dunkirk's beaches 4 years earlier. Their survival in 1940 directly enabled victory in 1945. The small boats themselves became historical artifacts. Many survived the war and returned to civilian service. Some remain operational today, maintained by preservation societies that recognize their historical significance. Sundowner survived until 1968, when deteriorating conditions forced her scrapping. Other boats, Medway Queen, Princess Elizabeth, Eastney, were preserved and restored. They appear in ceremonies commemorating the evacuation, physical reminders of an event that exists mostly in memory and history books. Charles Lightoller died in 1952, having survived both Titanic and Dunkirk. His obituaries mentioned both events with equal prominence, treating his 1940 Channel crossing as comparable in significance to his 1912 survival. In his final interviews, Lightoller emphasized that Sundowner's trip wasn't heroic or unusual. He had a boat, the Navy needed boats, volunteering was the obvious choice. He dismissed suggestions that crossing the Channel at 76 under combat conditions was remarkable. People did what was necessary. The circumstances were extraordinary, but the response was ordinary. Anyone with a boat and basic competence would have done the same. That assessment was characteristic of the generation that fought World War II. Understated, factual, resistant to romanticization. But it was also incomplete. Not everyone volunteered. Many boat owners refused requisition, claiming mechanical problems, safety concerns, or simple unwillingness to risk their property. The 845 who did volunteer made a choice. They could have declined, falsified their boat's capabilities, or simply not responded to the BBC broadcast. They chose to go. The psychological question is why. Financial compensation was minimal. The Admiralty paid token fees that didn't cover fuel costs, much less equipment damage or loss. There was no legal obligation. Civilian vessels couldn't be compelled to operate in combat zones. Personal risk was obvious. Boats were bombed, strafed, and sunk regularly. Rational calculation suggested staying home, yet hundreds volunteered anyway. Part of the explanation was cultural. Britain in 1940 had a strong maritime tradition. Many boat owners were ex-military, retired sailors, or maritime professionals who understood what evacuation failure meant. There was also social pressure. When neighbors learned that someone with a suitable boat hadn't volunteered, reputation suffered. But primarily, people volunteered because the alternative was abandoning 300,000 soldiers to capture or death. The moral calculus was straightforward: risk versus certainty. Going to Dunkirk meant risk. Not going meant certainty that more men would die. Given that choice, enough people chose risk. The German failure at Dunkirk haunted their strategic planning for the rest of the war. The evacuation demonstrated that Britain's army remained intact, that invasion would be contested, and that achieving air superiority over the Channel was essential. Operation Sea Lion required absolute Luftwaffe dominance. When the Battle of Britain proved that dominance was unattainable, invasion plans were shelved indefinitely. Dunkirk's success directly contributed to Sea Lion's cancellation by proving Britain could organize massive maritime operations despite German air superiority. The evacuation also revealed German weaknesses. The Luftwaffe had achieved tactical air superiority over France, but couldn't prevent evacuations conducted under their noses. German naval forces, supposedly controlling the Channel, couldn't interdict hundreds of small boats crossing repeatedly. The Wehrmacht's vaunted combined arms coordination broke down when faced with a fluid, improvised operation that didn't conform to expected patterns. These failures foreshadowed later German defeats: an inability to adapt to unexpected situations, over-reliance on doctrine, and assumption that military superiority would translate directly into operational success. British planning improved significantly after Dunkirk. The Admiralty learned that civilian resources could be mobilized rapidly if frameworks existed. Small vessels pools became permanent, maintaining updated lists of requisitionable boats and pre-planning their deployment. When Operation Overlord was planned in 1944, civilian vessels were integrated from the start. The mulberry harbors, artificial ports deployed during the Normandy landings, were essentially industrialized versions of the Dunkirk evacuation, massive capacity, shallow draft, and designed specifically to overcome the problem of getting men and equipment from sea to shore when conventional ports were unavailable or destroyed. The evacuation's influence extended globally. The United States studied Dunkirk extensively when planning Pacific operations, particularly amphibious assaults that required moving troops from ships to beaches under fire. The Higgins boat, the landing craft that became synonymous with D-Day, emerged partly from analysis of what worked and what failed at Dunkirk. The Japanese used Dunkirk as a case study for their own evacuation planning, though their circumstances differed significantly. In the decades after the war, Dunkirk's reputation evolved. Initial accounts emphasized the miraculous nature of the evacuation, treating it as divine intervention or extraordinary luck. Later analysis focused on German tactical errors, particularly Hitler's halt order. Modern historians recognize that multiple factors contributed: German mistakes, British determination, favorable weather, effective improvisation, and yes, luck. No single explanation is sufficient. Dunkirk worked because enough things went right simultaneously, many of which were beyond anyone's control. The small boats occupy a unique place in this analysis. They weren't the primary evacuation method. Destroyers and larger vessels evacuated more troops. They weren't the most dangerous assignment. Destroyers suffered higher casualty rates. They weren't even universally civilian crewed. Many were operated by naval personnel. But they represented something militarily significant: distributed capacity. Instead of concentrating evacuation capability in a few large vessels vulnerable to single-point failure, the small boats distributed capacity across hundreds of platforms. Losing one destroyer cost 700 evacuation spaces. Losing 10 small boats cost perhaps 300. The redundancy made the entire operation more resilient. This principle, distributed rather than centralized capacity, became fundamental to military logistics. Modern amphibious operations use large numbers of smaller landing craft rather than fewer large ships for exactly this reason. The lesson learned at Dunkirk was that robustness often matters more than efficiency. An elegant system optimized for maximum throughput collapses when attacked. A messy system with redundant capacity survives and adapts. The irony was that Britain learned this lesson because they had no alternative. The Royal Navy didn't choose distributed capacity. They needed more boats than they had, so they used whatever was available. The improvisation succeeded, so planners later codified it into doctrine. Military innovation often emerges from desperation rather than planning. By June 4, 1940, when the last soldier boarded the last ship at Dunkirk, 338,000 men had been saved. The number exceeded every estimate. It represented approximately 98% of the Allied forces trapped in the pocket. Of the roughly 350,000 men encircled, only 40,000 were captured, mostly wounded or defending the final perimeter. For an evacuation conducted under continuous air attack with minimal planning against an enemy that controlled every advantage, the success rate was unprecedented. The human cost was equally unprecedented. Over 68,000 Allied soldiers died defending the Dunkirk perimeter. The Luftwaffe lost over 150 aircraft. The RAF lost 106 fighters and 80 pilots. The Royal Navy and civilian vessels lost approximately 3,500 crew members. For every 100 men evacuated, 2 others died enabling that evacuation. The mathematics were brutal, but given the alternative, 300,000 prisoners and the likely end of Britain's ability to continue the war, the cost was acceptable. Acceptable is a cold word for such sacrifice, but war operates on cold calculations. The strategic question in late May 1940 was simple. Could Britain save enough of its army to continue fighting? The answer determined everything that followed. If the evacuation failed, Britain would likely seek terms with Germany. Churchill's government would fall. Roosevelt's ability to support Britain would disappear. Hitler would consolidate his conquest of Europe and turn east to confront the Soviet Union with his western flank secure. The evacuation succeeded. Britain fought on. American support increased. The Soviet Union entered the war. The coalition that eventually defeated Germany emerged partly because 338,000 soldiers were pulled off a beach in June 1940 by destroyers, transports, and 845 small boats, many crewed by civilians who had never served in combat and had every rational reason to stay home. The boats that went to Dunkirk weren't crazy. They were just available when everything depended on availability. Charles Lightlocker and Sundowner evacuated 130 men in one trip. That number seems trivial compared to the overall evacuation total, but 800 boats each evacuated 130 men. That's 104,000 troops, one-third of the total, the difference between success and catastrophic failure. A single boat couldn't save the British Expeditionary Force, but 845 boats operating simultaneously, improvising constantly, accepting losses and continuing anyway, those boats changed the war. Today, if you visit the beaches at Dunkirk, they're peaceful. Families vacation there. Children build sandcastles. The water is clear. No oil burns. No bombs fall. The town has been rebuilt. The harbor functions normally. Nothing visible suggests that 80 years ago, this was where Britain's army came within days of destruction, and where hundreds of small boats performed the evacuation that kept Britain in the war. One memorial stands on the waterfront. It lists some of the vessels that participated. The list is incomplete. 845 names would require a monument larger than the beach, but the names present tell the story. Sundowner, Medway Queen, Crested Eagle, New Prince of Wales, Mona's Queen. Working boats, pleasure boats, steamers, tugs, yachts, none designed for combat, all used anyway because that's what was available, and availability mattered more than suitability. The last small boat to leave Dunkirk was the Thames yacht Constant Nymph, departing at 3 a.m. on June 4, 1940. The skipper looked back at the burning town, turned toward England, and sailed home with 37 exhausted French soldiers on his deck. The crossing was rough. German E-boats were still hunting, but they made it. 37 more men saved. Multiply that by 845 boats, add the destroyers and transports, factor in luck and weather and German mistakes and French sacrifice and RAF protection and 1,000 other variables, and you get 338,000. Not a miracle, just math performed under the worst possible conditions by people who refused to accept that the numbers made success impossible. The crazy boat that saved 338,000 lives wasn't one boat. It was all of them. Every yacht, tug, fishing boat, and pleasure craft that crossed the channel between May 27th and June 4th. Every civilian who volunteered when they could have stayed home. Every naval officer who abandoned doctrine and trusted improvisation. Every soldier who maintained discipline on the beaches when panic would have been understandable. Wars are not won by evacuations, but sometimes evacuations prevent wars from being lost. Dunkirk didn't win World War II. It just made sure Britain survived to keep fighting. And 79 years later, when studying how that survival happened, the answer keeps returning to the same stubborn fact. 845 small boats crossed the channel when nobody thought it could work, and it worked anyway. And that made all the difference.